Good morning. We have an exciting day ahead for you, but before I get into that, I'd like to remind the audience that we have the NASA Help Desk out and to the right in the lobby area. I know many of you are in the middle of exciting projects or just starting to think about experiments in space that could benefit your product or technology. And there's a number of ways you can get connected to experts and have your questions answered. One of the best is the NASA Help Desk. So this morning we're going to pivot the program a little bit and focus on some areas very important to this region: innovation, investment in space, and the overall Silicon Valley tech community. First off, we'll have leaders from IBM take us on a journey in innovation, both on Earth and in space. Then we have a panel of investors and an investment banker who will open up our eyes to trends in capital investment in the new space ecosystem. There's been dramatic growth in investment over the last few years, and we have a panel of investors that represent the continuum of capital from very early seed stage all the way to late stage private equity. We also have a related event on the investment side this afternoon at 2:30 p.m. in Salons 12 and 13. We have a pitch event. We'll have a dozen space-related ventures pitching to more than 25 investors, and I expect more than 100 attendees there. So I'd like to invite anybody who's interested to join us there. Later this morning, we'll hear from a panel of Silicon Valley-based leaders who have leveraged the ISS National Lab as well as LEO to enhance their product or technology. We'll also be hearing from astronaut Mark Vande Hei about his incredible journey less than a year ago to the International Space Station and the amazing amount of research these astronauts were able to accomplish while there. Lastly, we will have two panels in the afternoon that focus both on the long-term demand in space and the role of international partnerships. This focus on demand and value creation is one that is critical to the ISS National Lab ecosystem and all of us in the room. Over the next few months at CASIS, you'll be hearing more about this through a series of white papers that we plan to publish. And we hope that this will highlight some data and trends that we see from our unique position that might help inform your businesses. So I have the pleasure of introducing our next panel, which consists of 3 investors and 1 investment banker. But before I do that, I wanted to make one quick announcement. Today, CASIS is releasing an online investor portal. On this portal, we plan to sign up about 100 investors that are currently in the CASIS Investor Network, and it will provide a platform for companies seeking capital within the new space ecosystem to post an investment opportunity and allow our network to view it and then facilitate connection between the person seeking capital and the investors interested. So up on the screen is a hyperlink. It's pretty easy to remember, iss-casis.org/invest. Please log on, sign up. Hopefully it adds some value for you. All right, now to the fun part. I'd like to introduce the panel. We have first Tess Hatch. Tess is an investor with Bessemer Venture Partners in their Silicon Valley office. She's focused on frontier technology, specifically commercial space, cybersecurity, and drones. Tess currently serves as a board observer for a number of companies, including Rocket Lab and Spire, and was previously a mission manager at SpaceX, where she worked with the government on integrating their payloads with the Falcon 9 rocket. Welcome, Tess. Come on up. Brandon Farwell is a partner at X-Fund. Prior to X-Fund, he was an investment professional at Draper Fisher Jurvetson, focused on software and frontier tech investments, including Planet Labs and SpaceX. After DFJ, he helped build the 150-company portfolio at Rothenberg Ventures, which also included SpaceX and Planet, among some other space investments. Brandon focuses mainly in enterprise technologies, notably machine intelligence, VR, AR, robotics, space, autonomous vehicles, and drones. Brandon's been an advisor to CASIS over the last couple of years, and we're appreciative of that. Welcome, Brandon. Next up, we have Justin Stevens. He's a senior partner in the private equity group at Apollo Management, where he joined in 2003. Apollo's latest fund, it closed last year with a record $25 billion in commitments, which I believe made it the largest private equity fund in the world. Justin covers the diversified industrial sector, which encompasses aerospace and defense, capital goods, machinery, and other value-added manufacturing industries. He currently serves on the board of directors of Tegra, Constellus, and Veritable Maritime. Welcome, Justin. And last but not least, our moderator is Ann Kim. Ann is a director at Silicon Valley Bank within its Frontier Tech Group. Ann works with a range of high-growth companies with a focus on all things aerospace, from satellites to rockets to vertical takeoff, landing aircraft, and drones. Ann adds value to entrepreneurs, investors, and influencers in the hardware, deep tech, and aerospace communities by cultivating an active network to make connections and provide financing solutions. Ann, thanks for your support. Silicon Valley Bank is also co-hosting the pitch event that we're holding this afternoon. So thanks for your support. Welcome.
Great, thank you. Great. So thank you, Warren. It's so exciting to be here today, especially because of this esteemed panel. I think it's great to have such a range of experience here. Everyone here sitting next to me, they've actually been involved in the space or aerospace industry earlier, before it was considered cool and hot right now in the industry. So I wanted to spend some time to really dig in, to understand what the trends are, figure out what they're excited to work on, and also how they're thinking about the growth strategy for a lot of the companies that they're seeing today. So with Brandon at X Fund, I really wanted to dig into kind of understanding your fund dynamics, how you look at portfolio companies, and how you think about the current investment process versus handing it off to the next kind of the next investor that would come in to lead the next follow-on round.
Sure. Is this working? Hopefully, yeah. Great. So we're just shy of $100 million early stage venture fund. So in terms of how we think about space investing, we're looking predominantly on more kind of asset-light, capital-light opportunities. We will look at next kind of net new constellation owner-operators that are leveraging kind of new sensor types to be able to do either Earth observation or communications. But I'd say predominantly on the software side is where we're most interested. So companies that are applying machine intelligence predominantly to I'd say data sets that are unlocked by these constellation owner-operators. So there's been a proliferation of them the last sort of 5 to 7 years, but that's predominantly kind of the software layer, again, much more asset-light. Because as a $100 million fund, unfortunately, we're not the $25 billion juggernaut of Apollo or the multi-billion dollar juggernaut of Bessemer. So we don't quite have the deeper pockets to be able to continue to support these companies. But given we invest early, we'd like to identify them early and hopefully be able to support the founders when it's more in the kind of ideation, recent launch kind of test phase. So that's kind of how we think about it.
Got it. Okay. And then when would be the right time to bring in somebody like Tess from Bessemer?
You'd have to ask her that. But I'd say, and I'd love her take actually, predominantly early signs of traction, quote unquote, with respect to honestly team caliber.
Got it.
I mean, when we're investing at this stage, it's looking at the experience of the team, what they've done prior, and what sort of frustration with the status quo or what disruption they've noticed while operating in a prior life to be able to actually start something new. Okay. So again, team caliber, and then not necessarily another me too, something unique. Approach to either launch or constellation, or again, the software analytics layer of the overall space stack on how we're gonna kind of identify be able to solve different business problems using space data, mostly Earth observation. Yep,
makes sense. Great. And so then, Tess, let's pretend that I'm a founder and I'm trying to pitch to you for a Series A. And I'm thinking about, I have a target valuation in mind, I have some traction, but how should I be thinking about setting up the pitch? What kind of metrics are you looking for? And how should we really prepare for the best way to make sure that you're interested to be the lead or at least to participate?
Definitely. So Bessemer is a large fund, and we invest in every vertical. And I work on our deep tech roadmap, which includes commercial space. And what Brandon alluded to is we like to lead Series A's. So Brandon is a wonderful seed fund, and we love to follow on his investments with a larger check size, usually in the range of 3 to 10 million, depending on the needs of the company. So if it is a software company, usually that is less. If it's a hardware, it's more, and we don't shy away from that. We're investors in Rocket Lab, a rocket company, and Spire, a constellation of CubeSats. So to the question of what an entrepreneur should let an investor know, there's things other than revenue that a space company has the ability to share. So whether that's assets in space, so I definitely look for satellites in orbit if it is a hardware company, or at least a launch manifest where they will have X number of CubeSats or microsats in orbit by a certain time period. If it is a software company, it's customers. I think that's probably the #1 most important thing any company should focus on, is who are the customers, what are the size of the contracts, the recurring avenue or horizon of the contract. And last, taking a step back, I would just urge an entrepreneur to know their VC regarding, first, if venture funding is the right avenue or financial institution for their business, and depending on what stage they're at, who they should talk to.
Great. And then coming over to Apollo. So congrats on the 25 billion.
Thank you.
It's a massive, massive size. And it's awesome to see that you're interested in all of these different aerospace companies. So how do you foresee Apollo really playing a big role as these capital-intensive businesses continue to grow and they, as they're closing contracts with the federal government, with others, how do you kind of deal with that situation?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks a lot, Ann. I think as we mentioned, we're obviously, Apollo is traditionally much later stage of an investor, than Tess and Brandon. I think, I think we're probably best known for our, large private equity fund, where we own control positions in 30 some odd companies across a variety of industries like ADT, Rackspace, and Chuck E. Cheese. But in addition to that, there's anybody who has young kids, obviously. But in addition to that business, we are also and much less known, a very large provider of growth capital for later stage startups that have a contracted revenue base and large capital needs. Our capital isn't necessarily going to be pure equity. It's usually going to be some sort of hybrid, whether it's preferred or mezzanine or some sort of convert or something like that, which we can kind of structure for a company's needs. So it's less expensive and less dilutive than venture equity. On the other hand, we don't want to take as much risk because we're getting a lower return. And so the way that we kind of structure that box is we come in later when things are a little more boring, maybe a little more dependable. And so usually there, like we said, there's kind of big customer contracts. So we have comfort that we're not taking market venture risk, we're taking build risk or execution risk, and that's what our capital is being used for. So I think as a result, a lot of the rocket science, no pun intended, is figured out by the time we come in. It tends to be more of an understanding of contracts and structuring than it is about new technologies. So we don't get to, I think we probably are coming in at a little less of a fun time than in the early stages. But once again, it's more of kind of a bread and butter financing. I was joking to, one of my colleagues the other day that, all these kind of, at a conference like this, I'm humbled with all the really smart scientists and entrepreneurs and executives that are really on the bleeding edge. I'm fulfilling a lifelong goal of being the dumbest person in a panel at an entire conference, so.
I may have beat you. Got it, great. And then as we think about the trends, so in 2017, we saw over 4 billion coming into private investments. We saw over 100 different financial institutions participate. 2018, we've already seen over $1.5 billion come in, mostly in small launch companies and satellite companies. Now, the small launch companies have received the most in the number of deals, but for satellites, it's been a lot of the actual just the dollar amount itself. So I'm curious what you guys are thinking and seeing on the small launch side. What stands out to you? I know right now we've seen the trend of a lot of different rocket companies getting smaller. We've seen companies like Spin Launch using the different centripetal force to launch into orbit. We've seen some thinking about strapping on to a 747. We've seen Worldview using high-altitude balloons. So I'm curious about your guys' thoughts on like what stands out to you and why.
Yeah, sure. I'll open, and you're probably going to be saying something much more insightful than I will. But so full disclosure, I'm a spin launch investor. And actually Tess is an investor in a different launch company with Rocket Lab. So probably get two different perspectives. So my biggest question on utilizing a rocket as an infrastructure to get assets up in space is how are pricing dynamics going to change over time? And of course, the risk of combustion actually having a rocket get there, there's of course the risk associated with actually getting there. Whereas with utilizing the ground to be able to actually spin an object, just to use the spin launch case, to be able to get into LEO, I think takes a whole nother layer of risk out of the equation. And then to the point on pricing, if everybody's kind of offering, I can get this payload X into orbit by Y timeframe, how does that change over time with respect to being able to command a premium in pricing? That's my biggest question on launch, because I've seen a lot of net new approaches, but again, mostly on the rocket side. Why I was attracted to spin launch was that reason. It was a different approach. They could also decrease the actual cost of being able to get X kg up into LEO. So again, I think it's a pricing question, the risk in the elements behind actually using a rocket. I mean, it's like risk upon risk upon risk. And we're constantly figuring out ways to minimize risk, or at least identify it and be comfortable with it. So yeah, that's how I think about kind of launch today.
Got it. Okay. And then, Tessa, how about yourself? So I know that you work with Rocket Lab. They're obviously ahead on the commercial side, just having a successful test launch and then also planning to be commercially viable this year. So any thoughts on just how they've approached the market and their growth, continued growth?
Yes, so Rocket Lab has had thus far 2 successful launches. The second deployed 4 satellites, so 2 Planet Lab Doves and 2 Spire lemurs into low Earth orbit, including their own Humanity Star, which was a way for the world to experience the overview effect. And we're looking forward to launching our 3rd rocket at the end of next month. So we'll hopefully have a monthly launch cadence coming up, and if not, sooner. A question that you had regarding the trends of the industry, rockets getting smaller, constellations of CubeSats, and what's to come. I think it's important, before making a prediction of the next space catalyst, it's important to think through the history of where it's gotten to today. And those 2 factors were, like you said, the standardization of the form factor of a 1U CubeSat. Professor Bob Twiggs and a Cal Poly SLO professor invented this small satellite where you could put commercial off-the-shelf sensors, send it into space, and either take photos of the Earth or communicate with the constellation. And all of these people decided to flock to this new form factor, this new novel idea to utilize space. Wonderful. But now there wasn't a way to get that asset into orbit. Being a mission manager myself at SpaceX, I would see secondary or tertiary payloads get bumped from mission to mission because they were focused on the primary, which is why ISSRDC and the ability to test on the International Space Station via CASIS is such a lovely alternative method. But if you're not being a secondary on a Falcon 9 or via ISS CASIS, testing on the International Space Station, there was this huge bottleneck in the industry of a low Earth orbit launch vehicle, which gets to this conversation of spin launch and Rocket Lab. And there's probably a few dozen now low Earth orbit launch vehicle companies that are tackling this issue. And I still see this as the most fruitful opportunity at the present day. Our job, though, is to look 3 to 5 years out, 7 to 10 years out, 2 to 3 years out, depending on what stage you're investing. I don't know, Justin, you have a better answer to that. And what's next to come? That's where I think operating in space is most exciting. So using the space stack, which is launch vehicle, which is manufacturing or material technology, satellites, and you don't necessarily have to be a space company, but you're operating in space, whether it's mining, manufacturing. My personal favorite is a space tourist. I keep applying to NASA's astronaut training application process. I don't know who I need to talk to in this room, but I keep getting rejected. But that's also why I'm here today, to talk to entrepreneurs that think that their idea is the next catalyst in the space industry.
And when When we think about launch costs, it's usually, because we're not backing an earlier stage launch company, it's more going to be for the eventual cost of getting other infrastructure that we're investing in a space. We're going to think of it more as a macro level of what's the cost, what's capacity utilization, who are the various, we're not picking specific horses or rockets for that matter in terms of who's getting people to space, but it's more, what does that utilization and demand mean to overall pricing, timing, certainty, and things along those lines.
Great. Great. Now, how about the satellite space? I know that the imagery space is pretty saturated. We've seen some new companies out there like ISSI over in Finland. They just got their first SAR satellites up. So curious about any thoughts on what areas within the satellite space you're excited about.
You want to start, and then I'll try.
So Spire is the largest general purpose constellation of CubeSats. We have AIS sensors for naval tracking, ADS-B sensors for plane tracking, and GPS radio occultation sensors for weather data. I am most looking forward to investing in next the communication space. I think IoT, certain Internet of Things, machine to machine is extremely fruitful and large. Although OneWeb and SpaceX triple and quadruple digit number of satellite constellations terrify me. But on the Spire side, I'd be curious because Brandon is involved with Planet, which is the largest constellation of CubeSats, Earth observations.
Right, yeah.
I'd love your thoughts.
Yeah, largest privately owned constellation, exactly right. I'd say, the Earth observation market, to Tessa's point, is dwarfed by the broader satellite comms and connectivity and communication market. I mean, I think Earth observation today is sub 2-3 billion, growing, but still minuscule with respect to comparing it to comms, which is, I think, an area that you opened this answer with of, this is where we're excited next, and I think that's right. I mean, so am I. I haven't made an investment, but I think there's some new companies that have kind of been launched the last sort of 2 or 3 years that are innovating there that are actually pretty compelling. I'd say another one in addition to kind of optical would be SAR, synthetic aperture radar. So, the utilization of radar that can pierce through nighttime and cloud cover, I think is another kind of unique sort of sensor, quote unquote, if you will, that we've seen. I'm an investor in Ursa Space Systems, also part of the Cases community. It's been a great company. They just raised a great Series A with some great partners. That's more on the analytics layer as well, helping provide kind of machine intelligence behind SAR imagery, which of course has its benefits and its cons in compared to an optical image that would perhaps go alongside of a dove, the doves that Planet has. But I've seen a lot of innovation in kind of net new sensor suites beyond optical, hyperspectral, which you could say is a subset of the optical SAR, and then of course what the folks at Spire are doing, and then as well companies like Planet IQ as well. They're kind of unlocking using GPS occultation to do weather prediction. So we've seen different techniques, and I think we're still relatively early days in being able to commercialize. I think Planet's done a great job being kind of one of the first ponies to kind of jump into market. But that's been a story that's almost a decade in length, kind of early 2010. But they've been able to commercialize pretty well the last few years.
Great. And then, Justin, how do you think about valuations? I know that for a lot of these companies that are in the aerospace world, or at least for satellites and rockets, we haven't seen that many exits. Now, we saw Orbital ATK. That was probably the most large deal that I've seen recently. But as we think about exit opportunities and valuations, how do you assign numbers to these companies?
Yeah, no, it's an excellent question. And as a value investor, a lot of the new growth opportunities that come into space are hard for us to make a control equity underwrite, which is why we use our hybrid capital in order to make these sorts of investments to enable their growth, as opposed to full ownership. Because I think to your point, it's there's especially now we're in kind of year 10 of an equity market bull run. I think people have very varied expectations of value. I think especially in a market like space where we're in inning 1 or 2 of what should be an incredibly long run, which Brandon refers to as Space 2.0. Space 1.0 was very profitable for a long time, but we mentioned CubeSats in the last discussion. Talk about a disruptor. I mean, what CubeSats did to kind of the old line businesses was completely destroy that business model. We historically were big investors in Space 1.0. We owned Intelsat. we own Hughes Telematics, to name a few. And the CubeSat market has kind of completely changed those companies' business plans and turned them upside down. So, I think it makes it hard, right? Because you have to say this particular technology, when you want to buy it as an ultimate, acquirer who's going to, whether for cash flow or for whatever, you have to kind of really have your, really have a defined goal and plan for how much this is going to grow and how long this, vintage of technology is going to be fruitful.
Got it, great. And so I've been working with a lot of different CubeSat companies in the past several years, and there's always a debate. It's, should we get out of the hardware side and just own the data? Should we just play with the data and cut it out, resell it? Or should we do the whole thing, right? Should we create the satellites, put them up into orbit, own the data, and then try to resell it? How do you guys think about it? I know there's Orbital Insight, which has done a great job doing data only. Then there's other companies that are trying to think about, maybe I should do projects, test it out, try to gravitate away from government projects on the commercial, and go towards the commercial side. So these are common questions that I see from a lot of these satellite companies. Do you guys think about or have a preference of data versus the full stack?
Well, we have a selfish motivation, right? Which is that we'd love to finance the hardware and control the hardware. So we'd rather you focus on, the capital light parts. We've kind of made a good business out of that. I oversee an investment we have in a company called Tegra in a different industry. Tegra does a bunch of manufacturing for Nike. Nike doesn't want to do, doesn't want to run factories. They want to build brands and communities. And so, what we like to say is we'll handle the boring, roll up our sleeves, capital intensive type stuff so that you can focus on what you're best at. And so, this is an obvious and I think ideal market for that mindset of when it comes to metal bending, when it comes to, things that are less kind of frontier, there's better capital, there's better, kind of managers for kind of handling that stuff and optimizing for it that can free up, growing companies to do what they do best.
Got it.
Just briefly, I think you can command sort of dominance in pricing power. I keep saying that, but I think it's really important in this particular market as the commercialization in the private sector for space is sort of just starting to really kick off well. But to maintain a unique position in the market, I think because you own the data, you create the data, you actually build, to use your terminology, full stack, you can, again, command and control pricing. And without that, and you're just another kind of analytics company that's buying a variety of kind of data sets from a variety of providers, you're beholden to them, and that's a little scary. You don't really necessarily control much with respect to what you can pay. Perhaps it's that price per square kilometer of Earth observation data is the cost of unlocking that. Fortunately, is going down, but is therefore, as a reciprocal of that, the price that you're charging for it, is that also going down as well? So that you kind of have two unfortunate occurrences there. So can you command a premium for that you're unlocking? Yes, because you own it and you can control it. But with more demand for it, maybe you can get price to go up a little bit. But you have a lot of new, as I mentioned before, kind of constellation owner-operators, unlocking new data sets. So you're going to have a lot more supply on the market. So is the cost of that kind of set of Earth observation data going to decline over time? I think that's going to be a yes.
Got it. Great.
If you're an early stage company or founder, you should focus on whatever you are uniquely, perfectly optimized to solve. There should only be a handful of people in the world that understand or have found this problem, and therefore you are that perfect person to focus on. Then, of course, as you grow, you can vertically integrate into other parts of the stack, but starting off, you should definitely focus on that pain point that you've found and that a solution would help a large addressable market.
Great. And I've seen the government very heavily involved with a lot of the earlier stage companies. There's a lot of funding, there's grants. Would you recommend that companies start with the government all the time, or should they try to focus on the private space as well? Sometimes it's hard because there's companies that are too deep with government that they don't have the actual resources to multitask. How do you think about private versus public?
I've seen companies be successful working in tandem with both private sector and public sector, and also getting funding, sometimes non-dilutive funding from the public sector to test certain things or to get an aspect of your constellation kind of testing and testing environment, or actually getting a portion of it up more cost effectively because you have non-dilutive public funding. So I'd say running a track where you can kind of work with both out of the gates, I think would behoove. And I've seen companies completely ignore the public sector and just go perfectly into private, because that's, some would argue that's where a lot of dollars are, and perhaps a little bit less fickle. So I've seen both work.
Yeah, so I spend a lot of time in DC because Defense and Government Services is part of my expertise as well. And so, dealing with the government, dealing with Washington, it's a very particular animal, and it's much different than the, Silicon Valley or other areas that people are familiar with. It's full of incredibly intelligent people, but it's its own bubble. Sometimes I refer to Washington D.C. as a Swiss Army knife town, which is that everybody you speak to has a very specific specialty knowledge-based set of connections. And I think obviously unlocking value for an early stage company or a startup through government contracts can be a great source, but people can't make the mistake that they have one government contact and that's what they do, or you approach the Department of Defense the same way you approach the intelligence community, the same way you approach NOAA and other kind of entities. You really have to view each of these organizations separately. They think differently, they have different objectives, they have different needs. And so I think that education is really important. And we spend a bunch of time, and I think that's an area where an investor, whether in private equity or venture, can really help their startups, because it's a good use of my time to go to Washington, D.C. every month and develop relationships. It might not be the best use of a portfolio company's time because they have a business to run. And so I think kind of a good example of that.
Gotcha. No, that's great. So as you compete for deals, right, we've seen a ton of new entrants into the market, so many financial investors. There's some that traditionally were strategic. There's a lot of institutionals that are coming in. There's a lot of global investors. So how do you think about the deals? Like, where are you sourcing your deals, and how should companies find you? Right, and how should they be thinking about your competition as they compare proposals, term sheets for their next round?
Sure.
Well,
go ahead. Go ahead.
Digging into that question, I think a combination of SpaceX increasing everyone's excitement about space, the public's, and specifically when Google acquired Skybox, only 4 years after Bessemer invested for a large return on our investment, I think every investor's ears perked up, and we're curious and didn't want to miss out on this new trend of investing in space. So since that, which was, we invested in Skybox 2010, it was acquired by Google in 2014, turned to Terabella, and now part of Planet Lab, all investors wanted to invest in space. So yes, people have gotten very excited about the space. However, I do think there's a difference between some financial institutions that have maybe one space company versus actively pursuing the area and are really dedicating the time and resources to invest in aerospace and specifically commercial space. So when it comes to pitching to VCs or which investor is the right one, I mean, no, are you gonna have to educate them on the space? Do they understand the space? Again, pardon the pun of saying space over and over again, but the industry as a whole, which is space. And then answering your question regarding sourcing deals or due diligence, that's why I chat with wonderful seed firms like X Fund and Brandon. Nah. And a whole. How about a really nice cup of coffee? Yeah. It's also why I love speaking at opportunities like this, keeping in touch with Warren and ISSRDC and CASIS. Also, wonderful space organizations, whether it's Stanford's Student Space Initiative, Berkeley has STAC, and maintaining those types of relationships and keeping connected with the space industry in general. Great.
Yeah, I'd say just a quick plug for Warren and team at CASIS. They've been a phenomenal organization to work with respect to having an open pipeline of opportunities that they work with for investors. And I've actually invested in 2 of the companies that were kind of introduced via CASIS. So in addition to that, at X Fund, we were actually founded in part by Harvard University, and we work very closely with universities, Berkeley, Stanford, MIT being some of them. So to Tessa's point, a lot of this innovation is done on university campuses. University of Colorado, in Boulder, Denver, there's a lot of innovation happening there. You mentioned Cal Poly, Stanford as well. There's been some great companies, MIT as of late. So I think, as a hub of innovation to be able to mine and map and of course be supportive, universities are a big kind of angle for deal flow for us. I think events like this, writing pieces about space and trying to be, have a unique perspective or an opinion, and being thoughtful behind that. And I'll also say, there's been more investment in space. Yes, it's kind of back to being attractive as a potential industry. Yes, the Skybox acquisition was exciting, and it kind of turned some folks' attention towards space. But I'd say it's still less than a half dozen, or maybe a dozen, of true early stage, call it seed and Series A venture firms that have a portfolio, not one investment, but a portfolio. Yep. Call that 2 or 3 investments in space. Got it. It's not very many. I'm hoping that increases, and I'm here like pounding the table to have that increase. But I think to use Justin's phrase, we're in inning 1 or 2.
Got it. Speaking really quickly of great space content, Brandon does have a piece that is a great read.
Oh. Thank you.
I'm forgetting what it's called right now.
I forget what it's called too,
I think it's
actually.
called Space Tech 2.0.
Could be space, yeah.
Space Tech 2.0.
Showing your expertise
They've clearly read it.
of the industry.
Okay, right.
That's right.
These guys have it too.
Funny story about that. So I got married back in September, and I was on my honeymoon, and one morning just was on the exercise bike for a few minutes, and I read Brandon's article when I was came to me through Twitter. And I remember because I eventually got put in touch with Brandon through one of my colleagues, Matt, and I said, "Oh, I read your article on my honeymoon." And he's like, "What's wrong with you? Why are you reading my article?" Yeah. But anyway, great honeymoon read for anybody out there.
Nice.
But I think to your point, Ann, I want to echo Brandon's comments about how CASIS has really done a great job of being kind of the North Star for investing in space opportunities, because it's really built a community. For us, we occupy a white space in the kind of late stage venture investing community with what we do, because like I said, we're coming in where people have the ideal time for us to come in is you have an opportunity, you hit proof of concept. You hit proof of commercialability, and all of a sudden you sign this massive contract with a governmental agency or a corporation. You have a capital-intensive business that has some sort of hardware or launch or other cost, and like the saying goes, you're the dog that caught the bus, right? And so what do? All of a sudden you've raised 20 or 30 million. Now you have to get your hands on $500 million. How do you solve that? It might not be the right time in that venture fundraising cycle to go raise the money that you need to fulfill these contracts. We all know that fundraising cadence is very important for kind of everything, optics and atmospherics and everything. You may not want to dilute, your current investors may not want to get diluted that much in a follow-on round of that size. And so for all these reasons, we come in and we can be a very compelling capital partner where we can structure it like, convert or mezz, and we'll be kind of at a lower coupon rate, usually mid-teens than, venture equity will cost you. And so for us, our offering is not for every company. It's for probably a very small part of the community. But obviously, we think we're a really good fit for most of the companies that fit that profile. So we kind of like to say that our funnel narrows really wide, but then it gets pretty, select pretty quickly. And so for us, space is an obvious great fit because it's capital intensive and there are big contracts. And so, we really, our whole important thing is to get our name out there so as many companies as possible know who we are. So the day you sign that big contract and you have that, oh no, we need a whole bunch of money, you know who to call. And, I think to Tessa's point too, we want, as a management team should be focused on what they're best at. They should also spend their money at what they're best at. And, we can help with the rest.
Great. So who to call is Justin from Apollo. So
can we get the number?
Yep. Yeah, so that's a great point. So, when I work with companies, I've noticed that a lot focus on equity. They don't really focus on debt. And maybe this is my own shameless plug because we provide venture debt financing, we provide working capital. So most times entrepreneurs who haven't raised debt think about it as, debt sounds bad. I'm embarrassed to say that I have debt on the books because that means that I am undercapitalized. But for hardware companies, I'd say that in my portfolio, about 90% utilize debt in some form or function. Software companies, not so much, just because their gross margins are so high. They don't really need to borrow if they have plenty of funding that they've raised on the equity side. So I'd say that for the earlier stages, you can come to SVB. And then as you continue to grow, then go to Justin. I mean, there's definitely a spectrum in the middle, and a lot of the actual institutional funds and strategics can provide help along the way. But I'd say be very selective with, what value are they providing? Is it on the partnership side, strategic? Is it more of the operating? Really be selective about who you're using or just taking onto your board. So I guess switching gears a little bit. So I know that all of you have been focusing on companies that are probably more local or at least within the US. How do you think about companies that are abroad? So we've seen a ton of aerospace or Space 2.0 companies in the US. Then next up is the UK. We've seen some in Singapore. Where else are you seeing talent? Where are the R&D teams sitting? And how are you managing sort of the org structure of all these companies as they become more complex?
So I have not invested in an international space company yet, which isn't to say I wouldn't.
Yeah.
But most of my focus and sort of network and attention's been kind of domestic US, again, mostly kind of coming out of universities.
Okay.
So unfortunately, I have not written a check in an international company, but I 100% would be open to it. Just haven't met the right one.
Okay. Great.
So Rocket Lab actually is a New Zealand-based company, and Spire manufactures our CubeSats in Glasgow, Scotland. So we've had to deal with various ITAR regulations, which we're all very familiar with being in the space industry. Like Rocket Lab, we launch and vertically integrate the rocket final assembly line in New Zealand, but we manufacture our engines in Los Angeles, California, and go back and forth via testing where we're doing so, employees that are different nationalities. It's been a wonderful advantage actually for us, just because we have access to talent in other areas of the world. So Spire, on the other hand, we have offices in Luxembourg, in Glasgow, again, even a larger pool of people to pull from. So I'm actively looking at space companies everywhere.
I think Tess mentions a good point when she mentioned ITAR. I think, especially for early stage startups, the second you start doing things outside of the, US, whether it's, relationships, whether it's investors, for whatever it is, make sure you know what you're doing and that you're aware of things like ITAR, CFIUS. I think a quick discussion with a regulatory lawyer could really go miles, because the last thing you want to do is make some decision now for a kind of near-term reason that when you find out down the road, oh, this precludes me from winning certain government contracts, or won't allow me to kind of sell this abroad. Those are things that you could get tripped up early on, and it's very hard to put the genie back in the bottle.
Great. So, what's on the horizon? So right now we have a lot of different launch companies that have their maiden voyages later this year. So after that, are you seeing, what's next, right? I've heard a lot about just the satellite-based internet, just radio. That's already been out there for a while, but there's security companies using satellites. There's a lot of manufacturing companies now based in space. And then further along, there's space tourism, there's asteroid mining, deep space. So what are you guys excited about, and what are you kind of looking forward to?
Yeah, I'm very excited about LEO manufacturing. And I think, once again, I think the CASES team has done a great job of encouraging a lot of R&D on the space station from private corporations to let them know that this is something feasible now. I think it's only a matter of time till 1, 2, 3 of these develop real legs and show a real benefit for manufacturing in space. I also think once you have that 1 or 2 true use cases, kind of, the magic of the free market kicks in, and all of a sudden you'll go from, half a dozen people in space to 50 people in space to 100 as the, and the infrastructure grows and everything like that. So, we see that as an obvious one. I think also those, it's going to be hard to predict when the first one comes. It could be any time, but I think that's how we see really the kind of key to things opening up. Launch infrastructure price going down was the first big step.
Okay.
CubeSats, obviously, and then we think that's kind of the next frontier, if you will.
Got it.
So with my personal hat on, I'm just intellectually curious about the kind of in-space manufacturing and testing, especially on the ISSRDC. I'm still thinking about wrapping my head around, is this a venture scale opportunity versus sort of like onesie-twosie contracts, in this still being compelling, but have we found the next greatest experiment or product or experiment test that has yielded something that's incredible for Ford or GM or whoever? I think that's still a little bit TBD. But when it happens, and I think it will, I think more investors will steer attention. But I'm actually really curious about the process of doing sort of edge computing data downlink of data while in LEO or GEO, having the efficiency of getting data back down to Earth such that we can quickly be able to manipulate, understand, and then be able to have the end customer who's using that data to solve business problems have much more real-time actionable intelligence on that data. So that comes through the full stack of data capture, data downlink, and then manipulation and understanding of that data happening in a much more frictionless process and quicker. That's what I'm keen to kind of learn about. And then, of course, also the communication element of helping us do a remote internet to folks in all parts of the globe that perhaps don't have access or can't afford. Of course, that's a lot of people are working on that too.
Yep, got it.
Reiterating, and when I think of an x-axis being time, the quickest or time horizon return on investment of 3 to 5 years I see as communications. Brandon was just chatting about. The next I see is manufacturing, like Justin mentioned, in case this allowed for Made in Space to test their 3D printer on the International Space Station. They're now producing Z-Plan or silicon fiber optics. So I think that's the one after, so 5 to 7, 10 years. And then the mining, the deep space, space tourism, all of the pharmaceutical testing, I think that is closer to 10 plus years. So I'm focusing on the shorter time horizon being a venture investor, but that doesn't mean that these aren't just around the corner.
Got it. And can you talk a little bit about the returns you're expecting on your investments? So again, just based off of the different fund dynamics, I know each investor has a different investment thesis and a different expectation on the return. Can you just share a little bit just so that entrepreneurs understand how they should be approaching you if their business model or just their market opportunity is big enough for you guys?
Sure. Like we said, we're kind of looking for mid-teens IRRs. We're looking for investment hold periods of, say, 4 to 10 years. It could be a little longer, a little bit shorter, depending. But that's kind of our sweet spot. But once again, obviously taking less risk through kind of a contracted revenue base or things like that.
Mid-teens IRR, Justin, that's so boring. No. So I started my career in venture with DFJ, and DFJ is known for their moonshots, early investors in SpaceX and Tesla, et cetera. So now here with X Fund, we're much smaller, right? We're like sub 100 million or 75 million in fund size. So we have to believe with each incremental investment that we make, it has to have the potential to return the fund itself, which is a pretty tall order. But we really are looking for kind of entrepreneurs that think that way and like Spin Launch, right? Like who actually are revolutionizing how launch is going to happen. So it's kind of, I hate to use the phrase again, but moonshot types opportunities, because we're going to be wrong most of the time. But when we're right, we want to be really right. So no offense to the mid-15 IRRs, but like that's the different kind of risk profile, right?
Absolutely.
Makes sense.
Absolutely.
So unfortunately, whether your fund size is 100 million or 1.6 billion, we're also looking to return the size of our fund. So before I dig into that, taking a step back, it's really important to ask, and saying this being an investor that wants to invest in early stage space companies, is venture capital the right means for your company? There are plenty of others that I would love after this, Anne, to help explain and share with all of us, since I focus on just a piece of the pie, which is VC. I give you X million or 1,000, and would like to take X percent of your company, so equity. With that being said, it's important to know the fund size of the venture capital firm you're pitching. So whether it's 100 million or 1.6 billion, I'm looking for a potential return on my investment to return the size of my fund. So that as a baseline, number one, is just really important to know. And if your total addressable market, or TAM, is smaller than the fund size, then I don't recommend talking to that investor.
Great. So I think that covers a lot of the questions that I had prepared for today. I wanted to give the crowd a chance to ask questions if there were any. I know that there was a mic that was going to be available. Not sure if anyone has any or if there's any hands. No.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
We do have some questions that have been put in online, and but I'm going to start with the one that I think is the most fun. What business criteria would a private sector company need to meet to win your financial support for a commercial space station in low Earth orbit?
Sorry, do you mind repeating the question a little louder?
Sure. Oh, no, I got volume now. What business criteria would a private sector company need to meet to win your financial support for a commercial space station in low Earth orbit? I thought we'd start with the small stuff.
Oh gosh.
So the question is for a full financing of a private space station? Is that the right way to think about it?
Sure.
Yeah, and they asked for what business criteria would be needed.
Got it. Well, I mean, I think obviously that sounds like a pretty asset-intensive one, so I'll start with that. I think, look, I think if you were to think about a private space station, you would think about that as orbiting real estate, right? And so you would want to make sure that you had tenants for that real estate. That's how we would think about it, right? So, you know, what's the likelihood of, you know, probability of success of getting up? Have you launched some sort of space station-esque, you know, materials already into low Earth orbit, or is it, you know, human, you know, is it kind of safe for humans, and do you have proof of that already? And then I think once that's all spec'd in, it's what customers do you have signed up? So what revenue's coming in? And once again, you're going to kind of think about it like you would think of a commercial real estate building, but with less gravity.
Digging into the tenant specifically, taking off of the Tesla Model 3 learning lesson and having them already putting down a deposit and starting to pay for it is incredibly important, along with technology and it working and being able to get it into LEO.
I wish I could afford that, but I can't.
Got it. Any other questions? Or?
Along similar lines, what investments can be made on or for the space station?
On or what the station?
On or
what investments can be made on or
ISS,
for the ISS?
as it stands now?
Oh, I think there's a lot going on right now already. Some companies have raised capital. I think venture as well, not just sort of angel or family office kind of capital, but testing on the ISS, materials testing, pharma testing. I think that's already been happening for years. Am I missing anything? No, I mean yeah.
And there's a lot. I know that I interviewed Warren for a piece that we just posted yesterday on SVB's innovation blog. But we're talking about Target, really reaching out to cases just to figure out how they can reduce water consumption in producing T-shirts in the retail side. There's also pharmaceutical companies, or Michael J. Fox with his Parkinson's Foundation. They're really able to test different, basically the genetic makeup of different molecules, just to make sure that all of the drugs are very specific to the actual form, right? The biological form. So, and it's a pretty active space, and there's a lot on the pharma side that's really interested in testing out there. But those are the ones that come to mind for me.
And I think what all of us can do and what we try to do is make that concept more mainstream, right? And I think Warren and the Cases team have been great at doing that and being the easy button for companies that want to do it. It's my mission to get as many early stage investors as possible excited in space station research and space, so that way there's more capital, there are more opportunities that kind of make their way to us.
Yeah.
And I would love to see a recurring pipeline of companies testing numerous portfolios of pharma experiments or materials testing, such that we can see, putting my investor hat back on, kind of this recurring nature of up to 5 years we're doing XYZ experiments, and we're happy paying that, and we want to pay that. That is out of our R&D budget. That is inked. That is solidified. That is not, we're just going to test once or twice and then we're going to pull back in the event of a downturn. That scares me.
Right. Yeah, I think everybody should incorporate the ISS in their product roadmap to test out the viability. Any other questions?
Thank you so much for your very good talk today. I just have one question. How do you guys deal with a service company, companies that provide services, not necessarily a product, or I want to say a testing on ISS, but it's more of a let's certify these procedures, and these procedures can apply for so many other things and review a program. How do you deal with that as an investor?
So how are you guys dealing with the services companies, right? With the certification and the procedures? Is that? your question?
Well, in the healthcare industry, you have a lot of companies that consider service companies, and they're not necessarily a product or a pharmaceutical. So if you have a company that it does a lot of services and they design, let's say, software programs and it's just software, how do you invest in that, or do you willing to be invest in those types of companies? All I'm hearing here is about, like, material testing, physical testing. How does that work?
Yeah, look, I think I could take. Look, I think there's obviously a whole ecosystem of service companies out there. I think they tend to require less capital at less of an early stage. Frankly, a lot of them can bootstrap themselves into success. So, especially, we're as an asset-intensive investor, there's not much need for us. Obviously, I spend a lot of my time in government services. That is a very lucrative place for somebody to start a company. You may not get a ton of attention from the VC community because they don't need you, but you could wind up selling your company to a large defense prime or other businesses because to your point, there's a whole ecosystem of companies that are providing services, and either you're providing a core competency faster or cheaper, or you've come up with a new solution. I think the biggest thing there is making sure that you have a good business development team because the sales cycles are very long. And so you need to make sure that you're able to kind of capture that.
Yeah, I think when I see service companies, it really depends on IP, right? So most services, consulting, it's a lot of just projects. But if you're finding and collecting insights and you're able to either package that, sell that, if you actually own that data, or you're doing it in a different way where you have the most market share of your of the potential market size, I think that's how people stand out. But most times, I don't see as many of the pure services coming out for VC funding on the equity side.
Would it maybe be helpful to explain how we get our money and how we're supposed to give the money back to our LPs on that side? So LPs are our limited partners. They give us X number of millions or billions of dollars, and a fund is raised every 3 to 4 years, depending on where you're at in your life cycle. And we take that capital as venture capital investors, invest that into startups, hoping for a return on our investment within that same time frame, 3 to 5 years. So what makes that difficult for a service company is the long sales cycles and just and depends on what service company you are, but we're really looking for that hyper exponential increase because, to be bluntly honest, of the 10 investments we make, 8 or 9 of them probably will return $0.00. However, that one moonshot idea that does return the size of our fund times 3 will make our limited partners happy. So it's a balance of cost of capital and the capital intensity of the business, product, service, and then the time horizon it'll take for that business, product, or service to return that capital. I hope that helps clarify.
Taz makes a good point. It's really hard for venture investors to look at services businesses because it's difficult for them to hit what I call escape velocity swiftly, which you can do with, say, a scalable software solution, which at the core is technology, versus services, which tends to be more inherent in human capital.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to use that escape velocity, like
escape
the space
velocity.
escape velocity for a
space
rocket or a company's escape velocity.
Yeah. You need an asterisk Brandon Farwell at the bottom.
Okay.
There's a question in front.
Going back to the commercial space government, what should the government do to make a commercial, let's assume for the sake of argument that a commercial station cannot live completely on its own, which I think is actually pretty safe. What could the government do to make it a viable business anyway?
Well, also, I think in many ways the government is doing, what they should be. What they're doing that right now with the International Space Station, which is, encouraging, encouraging development, making the easy button, helping people understand how to, get up there. I think connecting the dots between companies interested in research projects with the ultimate, government entities, whether it's National Science Foundation or others that have those budgets. So I think in a lot of ways, CASIS and ISS are doing that today. I think it's probably unlikely that they would do that in addition for another new commercial space satellite, because I think so much of the focus now is on, figuring out how to kind of get more, value or revenue out of the space station.
Perhaps, again, I haven't thought long and hard about this, but perhaps would the government be, to Justin's point about being like think about as real estate, tenants, like recurring revenue, getting sort of butts in the seats. Would the government be perhaps a good first customer and actual, like contractual buyer, quote unquote, of real estate? So like, yeah, we'll help finance it, but also we'll help be kind of the first, penguins to jump in the lake to actually start being paying customers to show the precedent of demand, and then perhaps the private sector will begin to form around it. I don't know, it's just an idea.
Giving an example of that, NASA gave SpaceX the commercial resupply missions, and that avenue to a government paying a private company to resupply the International Space Station with cargo and then hopefully eventually crew.
Yep, question over there.
That's a wonderful question. He basically asked, so we give funding, what else can an investor do? And that is a great question that you should ask every venture capital or investor person that you're going to partner, that you should work for. So a lot of our job is pattern recognition. So we've experienced, whether they're space companies or other companies in the past, and developed ways that we can, learning from past companies' mistakes or successes, carry on that. Also introductions to whether it's customers, other investors, people that you need. I always recommend, if you're meeting with someone, asking for something to see if they'll follow up doing it. And I just think ultimately a good sounding board. I mean, you have your board of directors or advisors or however you surround yourself at your company level with people that will be there for you during the great times, but especially the low times and the cycle, and make sure that they stick with you. And a good way of finding out if that person is a good investor is asking them for a reference sheet of all the entrepreneurs that they've worked with in the past, and calling up each of those people and asking them how it was with that person, with him or her on your board.
Yeah, just great answer. Not all money is equally green. I think some funds have a more activist, and I can mean that in a positive way, meaning on a weekly basis checking in with you to see what we can do to help. And I think two of those avenues could be recruiting, certainly at a stage that we invest in early on. A lot of the bottleneck is access to talent, engineering talent to help you build, especially in the space ecosystem. So I'd say talent pipeline. And then eventually you're going to need, if it's a capital intensive business, which most tend to be in space, you're going to need a Series A B, perhaps a C as well. So my job is to know great people like the folks to my left and right. So what I do, in part, is as our companies graduate to an A round or a B round, is to ensure that I put them in touch with not just the right firm, the right individual inside that firm. Because XYZ investor may not even focus on space, may not actually be, have the proper acumen and knowledge to be able to be helpful. But my job is to know who is the right person. And so it's to kind of help them as they've graduated on and sort of accomplished XYZ proof points that makes it more attractive to a Justin or to a Tess, that I can help facilitate that relationship.
Yeah, selecting the right investor is an incredibly important and underrated decision. It needs to be true partnership. You need to work with people who you really trust. It can't just be going for a flashy name or the biggest check. You have to find real partners, people who think like you do and that you like. I think Tessa and Brandon both hit on the fact that you need people who are going to be there for you on the bad days, even more so than on the good days. Whenever I speak to a new management team and walk them through who we are, I don't kind of give them the story of this one deal that we did that was our highest return. I usually walk them through an example or two of, here's a deal we did, and then the market hit us the wrong way, and it was really hard, but here's what we did to back our team, and we came out successful anyway. Because I think that's really the most important mark of a great investor.
Yeah, that's a really great point. And I'd say, to sum it up in a very cheesy way, there's the 3 C's. So it's really capital, customers, and culture. So companies will always need follow-on financing or just growth. The customers, it's very important just to continue to increase your valuation. And then culture, hiring. There's a lot of talent partners at funds, just people know people in the Valley. A lot of times, even with their portfolio companies, if they have somebody getting acquired, they know who the right engineers are that are right for hiring. And so I would definitely tap into your investors for those 3 topics.
Digging into that one more step further, the operations team. Most VCs have an operations team that help with talent, that help with marketing, that help with business development, corporate introduction. So dig in and ask each VC how that side of their firm works.
Yeah. Is another question in the back?
Just a quick question, and I think we've already started to touch on this, is in terms of entrepreneurship and also company formation. And so maybe more in the tech, Google-y type companies now, you have a lot of spin-offs and AI very hyped, and you have a lot of universities, people coming out and starting their own companies. What's the tipping point, or when is the tipping point for space entrepreneurship and company formation? Is it the likes of SpaceX who are inspiring? And I'm just wondering if you're starting to see an increase in company formation and more people coming into the space versus going off and doing an e-commerce company or something like that.
So is the question, what's the tipping point of space and industry becoming larger?
And company formation, getting entrepreneurs to enter the space.
Got it.
Okay. I think space tends to be an industry that having deep experience and knowledge of the inner workings versus just starting like an e-commerce company, I think is much more acute background experience and kind of knowledge. So when I think about early stage investing, again, hopefully this answers your question, a lot of it is akin to the experience background of the team, critical. Versus spinning up another kind of e-commerce, again, use my example, e-commerce company selling shoes. Anyone can figure that out. Space, it's a much more refined, deliberate skill set, I think.
I mean, I guess I could take that in a different pathway. When I opened accounts for Planet, actually, this was years ago, where Robbie came over to our office, and I asked him, what is your long-term vision of the company? And he came from NASA. A bunch of the founders, they all work together on very technical projects. And so he had mentioned that once he has a constellation up in orbit, and when they have daily downloads of the data, they want to create this API platform, let engineers and developers sign on. They don't have to do any of the hard technical stuff to get things into orbit. They can just use that data to create new business models. So his had a little bit more of a holistic approach of, I want to make the world a better place. My role in this is to really just do all of the technical, create the infrastructure, and give you that data or that platform to build off of. So when you ask about entrepreneurs coming into this space, I think that it's coming very soon. All these companies are increasing the frequency and the quality of the data, but it's up to you to figure out what that next step is. So use Planet.
Sure. No, that's a great example. We'll articulate the vision at that point of where we want to be in 4 or 5 years.
Yep.
I think about some of the investments I've made. With Planet, exactly Will Robbie, et cetera, all former folks that spent time at NASA, and then Adam Mayer, founder of Ursa, also spent time at SpaceX. Chris Richins, founder of RBC Signal, spent time at SpaceX. So understanding these pain points while you're operating at in these companies really helps kind of shed light on why are you doing this? Why do you care?
Right.
Because starting a company is not easy. It's I think. It's revered in the press. It's revered culturally, certainly in the United States, the greatest country in the world. But it's not easy. So you need to be able to have the grounded experience of having kind of gone through part of it.
Right. Definitely. Great. Yes. Question.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks for the insights. I was wondering what your thoughts were on when you consider most new space companies, the anchor tenant's still the federal government, or some sort of government agency. So how does that handle with your investment styles? If you consider Planet selling images back to the government, or if you consider SpaceX with the reusable
Sorry, do you mind turning the microphone louder? I'm having trouble hearing.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Thanks for your insights. I was wondering, when you're making your investments, most of the commercial space companies tend to have anchor tenants with governments. So does that change your investment style? Do you look towards more public-private partnerships, the decadal surveys, these types of things when you're considering?
I'd love to see diversification in the customer base. I think Jess made up the point of like if you just have kind of DoD or just government contracts, yes, I mean it could take 2 or 3 years to get them, or less if you're great. But being able to actually penetrate the private markets, because in the public sphere, you're beholden to political regimes, and though that funding may change, it can be somewhat fickle. But as in the private markets, you have that risk profile completely taken out. So I'd say a hybrid approach can be beneficial.
I think also, I agree a hybrid approach is the way to go. I think to the extent that a company is fortunate enough to get government, as a customer, I think making sure, once again, that they understand the exact details of how to onboard that customer, audit the revenue stream, all of the rules that that specific agency has. It's much more fickle and precise than it is with a private sector customer. I think a lot of people think, oh, we have these 5 companies and then the government is 6. You need to have different systems, different tracking methods, different compliance protocol when it comes to those, or you can get yourself in big trouble when you had no ill will or intent at all. And so I think making sure that companies, once again, have that understanding early on, speak to those 1 or 2 right people, just to have that initial discussion of what am I getting myself into when I do this? To make sure that you're prepared.
And I think you'd be surprised at the amount of attention that the government is paying, I guess, to the private sector. So I talk to people at NASA, at the FAA all the time, and they get pinged by entrepreneurs, investors asking them for help. So they're giving out free advice. Now, granted, it may not be kind of all that they know because they do have to protect some confidential information, but for the most part, they can really help you navigate the actual kind of political, hurdles that most people are scared of. So we have 2 minutes remaining. So any other questions? Any final thoughts?
One last question.
Looking over the Atlantic to Europe, I have the feeling that the risk affiliation and investment culture is really different. Do you have some comments on discrimination factors with investment and venture capital in the United States and in Europe?
Was it?
No, discrimination between the. I think I'm sorry. We're getting every like 3rd word, so it's hard to.
Was the question: is there a bias away from doing investments in Europe?
Yeah, I think the investments in Europe are not so much risk affiliated. So if you do a wrong investment in Europe, I think it's really you're out of business tomorrow. And in the United States, you do investments, and if you fail, and then you come a 2nd time or 3rd time, then you might get easier money. That's at least the feeling I have from all these discussions. Do you have some comment on why there's this difference between this technology affiliation here in the United States and more risk-taking affiliation compared to Europe?
So the question is about risk appetite, the U.S. versus Europe, correct?
Yeah. Go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, I think risk appetite is just an interesting beast, and it depends on where you are, the type of capital you're providing, and it really kind of there's kind of within a community of investors, there's a whole bunch of different exigencies that kind of affect how people think about risk, which I think really manifest themselves when you're doing business in various places. Like I said, being New York based, spending time in Silicon Valley, and then also spending time in Washington, D.C. I spent a lot of time kind of what I call kind of the 3 bubbles of understanding how the different way people think about risk and other factors in different places. And I think, just as an example, and this doesn't touch on Europe, but to your point, in the kind of New York finance world, the biggest concern of investor is don't lose money on an investment, right? Like whatever you do, don't lose money. You can miss the big one, but don't lose anything. Whereas I think in San Francisco and the Bay Area, it's much more don't miss out on the next big thing in your area. And so just worrying about just having that as kind of one example of an overlay, the way that peers compare themselves, the way that economics are cut. I think all of the things bake their way into the risk premium pie. And so I think to your point, it's probably hard to pinpoint 1 or 2, other than if you have a lower risk company with lower returns, try to migrate to those investors. If you have a higher risk, higher return investment, try to migrate to those investments and find the right partners for yourself.
Yeah, I think just briefly, Silicon Valley tends to be a little more forgiving with respect to starting a company, failing, starting another company, failing, because you just learn so much throughout that process that I actually love to back repeat entrepreneurs. And that's not necessarily the case the first time it was an Uber success. In fact, I sometimes like the fact that the first exit wasn't amazing. It was okay, you know, but hey, the next one, we're going for the gold. So like that's actually the repeatability you see a lot in Silicon Valley and maybe also parts of the US. But I think that general like sphere of failure that culturally may not be the case in parts of Europe. I can't definitively say that, but I know it is here.
I know at Bessemer we're actively investing in Europe, so we're trying to flourish and nourish that area as well.
Great. And so we need to wrap up now, but if you want a US investor, obviously these three are based in the US, so feel free to pitch your great ideas to them. And thank you so much for joining our panel.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.